Well, with that, we're going to turn it over to the lecture part, and I will hand it off to Maggie Hume, Director of Debate at Woodward Academy, lead instructor in the Hoya Spartan program, to talk to you about the topic.
Okay, so today, this morning, in this first section, we're going to be talking about sort of a general topic overview. We're going to be talking about why we're talking about China, give you some of the terminology that you're going to need in order to understand things in more detail. Then the follow-up to this is that Will Repko will be here in a little over an hour, and he will be talking to you about the packet in particular. So we're basically going from the general, why are we talking about China and what do we need to know about China in order to talk about China, to the very specific, which is what are the arguments you're going to be making in your first sets of debates. One thing to understand is that I understand that students have a really wide range of previous knowledge about China. So probably there are some of you who have lived in China or spent tons and tons of time there. And there may be some things where you're going along and you're like, this is a little basic. But from what we learned at the Hoya Spartan at the first section is that there are a lot of people who don't know a lot about China and so need to know some of those things in order to learn about the topic and have good topical debates. So the first sort of meta question that I was asking myself is why are we talking about China? And in particular, why are we talking about China right now, right? Debate topics every year. Why is this one China? So for why China, I really liked this quotation. This is by James Steinberg and Michael O'Hanlon. Steinberg is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. No, I'm sorry, O'Hanlon is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Steinberg is the former Deputy Secretary of State. So he was the principal deputy to Secretary Clinton when she was the Secretary of State under President Obama. And their argument is that the U.S.-China relationship is the most consequential relationship that the U.S. currently has. And that really the question for your generation is, are we going to cooperate with China, or does the fact that China is a rising power and the United States is the established power mean that there is inevitable conflict? And so you are going to hear a ton of different perspectives over the course of the year on that question. But I think this is sort of the essential question for the topic, is the future of U.S.-China relations going to be a positive one, shaping the world in positive directions, or is there a likelihood of conflict? This is not the first time that we have had a China topic. There have been China topics in both high school and in college, but not for a really long time. So in 1995 to 1996, predating all of you, there was a high school topic that is very similar to the one we have now. This one was about changing foreign policy rather than engaging China. And we'll talk about what engagement means in just a second. But it's very similar. 20 years ago, basically, we debated a very similar topic to the one we are debating now. This has also been a college topic. 10 years later, there was a college topic that's also very similar. This one specified what they had to do, what had particular areas, but it's a similar concept, although this one required the United States to increase pressure rather than engagement. So it's sort of the opposite of our topic. So then the question is, why are we doing this now? I have included some early warning humiliation as topic lecture entertainment, which is that this is what I looked like in 1996, and this is what I looked like in 2006. And obviously there are some differences. And we have not talked about China in a really focused way in a really long time, okay? It has been 10 years since China was a major focus of a topic. Certainly there are other topics that have touched on China. If any of you debated on the Latin America topic a few years ago, there was a major disadvantage that concerned China. But for the most part, it has been a while since we've done this. And part of the reason we're doing this now is that because China has undergone huge transformation. A professor in the University of California system says that it is fair to say China has undergone more social and cultural changes in the last 3 decades than in its entire 4,000-year history, okay? So 30 years, more change than 4,000 years, which tells you something about just where we have gone and where we are going now. There's that quote for you if you needed. You don't need to write it down. That's not really a write-down thing. It's just sort of a conceptualizing thing. So there's also some other reasons why we're debating China right now. Engagement versus containment. So engaging a country through things like trade and dialogue and establishing additional contacts versus containment, which is where the United States would attempt to more aggressively limit China's rise through policies like protectionism or even maybe isolating China, is an essential question for foreign policy experts right now. They're trying to decide how are we going to approach China and what are the effects of that. It's also interesting, this is an election year, and you're going to hear a lot more about the election's disadvantage, but this is an election year, and Trump to a very large degree, and Clinton to a much smaller degree, both think that we should be doing more aggressive policies toward China instead of less aggressive policies toward China. So Clinton's somewhat hesitant about China. Trump really, really, really dislikes the increased U.S. trade with China and the policies that he sees as letting China take advantage of the United States. There's also been a shift in relations since 2012, and we'll look at this in more detail when we get to the Chinese political situation. But since their new president, Xi Jinping, in 2012, China has become more aggressive in their approach to the United States and the rest of Asia. And so an interesting question that we're asking ourselves right now is, should we continue to engage China? And if so, how should we do that? And obviously on this topic, the affirmative is going to say, yes, we should increase our engagement with China, and the negative is going to say, no, we should not do that. So what is this engagement thing? It's sort of an interesting term, engagement, that we chose. Foreign policy experts generally use it to talk about adversaries. So should we engage a country that we have poor adversarial relations with? This would, if it was 1972, should we engage China is like the most important question. Now, there's some differences because we do a ton of engagement with China. When you're talking about diplomatic and economic engagement, which is our topic words this year, we already do just massive amounts of diplomatic and economic engagement with China. And so the question for the affirmative will be, what areas do we need to increase and improve that relationship? One question in the term engagement, and this will be debated out a lot in the topicality sphere, so I just wanted to sort of preview this for all of you, is that there is a discussion of what strategies or types of engagement should be pursued. And in that realm, what they're talking about is, should we pursue unconditional policies toward China, or what they call conditional or quid pro quo policies toward China? And what that means is that the question is, should the United States just sort of determine what our policy should be toward China and what our decision should be, and just sort of announce those? That is unconditional engagement, because it does not require China to have a response. It doesn't change based on a negotiation with China. A quid pro quo, which just means this for that in Latin, a quid pro quo agreement means that the United States only does a particular thing if China also agrees to do a particular thing. It is a negotiation between two parties. And one of the questions on topicality this year will be, is the affirmative allowed to be a quid pro quo? Are they allowed to be unconditional? Or are they allowed to be both? And I think, this will be a debate that you will have a lot. But I think most experts say that both are probably included under engagement, which opens up some possibilities for both the af and the neg. So when we're talking about China, I think it's important to understand just how big China is. So China is essentially 1 billion people more than the United States, okay? The United States population is about 300 million people, and China is about 1.3 billion people. China has 5 cities that are greater than New York City, and 14 cities that are greater than LA, which is our second largest city, okay? So they have 14 cities that are larger than our second greatest city. By 2025, about a quarter of the world's 200 largest cities are going to be in China. So the growth in population and in movement to the cities is astronomical. This map shows that if you divided the world up into, by population, 5 equal parts, one of which is China, about 1/5 of the world's population lives in China, one of which is India and its neighbors, about 1/5 of the world's population lives there. But if you were to try and equal that out using the United States, it would take all of North America, all of South America, all of the western part of Europe, and all of Australia to equal the number of people in China. Interestingly, by land size, this is a I liked it because this is a photograph called No Shortage of People Here. And this is not like a festival, this was just a street in China. All right, by land size, there's not actually a substantial difference between China and the United States. This is China sort of mapped onto the US. And basically they're very similar. The United States is very slightly small, or very slightly larger, but it's not a very meaningful difference. If you think of just sort of the United States and China in land as being about the same size, and in population, China is 1 billion more people, or about 4 times more people than the United States. So in order to understand how we've gotten to where we are, I'm going to run through a super brief history of China. And this is going to be about 170 years of Chinese history in about 9 to 10 minutes. So this does not replace your world history class. And for those of you who have taken, who's had a world history class in like the last 2 years? Oh, excellent. Okay, so you will be familiar with many of these issues. What I'm going to do is just sort of re-familiarize you with a few of them, and then talk about the takeaways for our topic. Like, why do these things matter for what we're talking about? Now. So, China is the longest continuous civilization on Earth. There's some debate about what exactly it means to be a continuous civilization, but it basically means that most of the area of China has been controlled by mostly the same group of people for the longest period of time anywhere on Earth. Before the 1850s, China is mostly a closed-off society. It's sort of a self-contained society. It is the regional power in East Asia at the time. Other countries in the region are paying tributes to China in order to secure some protection and other sort of agreements with it. But it is the power in the region. Starting in the 1850s, however, there's a set of foreign-initiated wars, which means people going to war with China, that led to the opening of Chinese borders to trade with the West. So this is when trade starts, and it's mostly as a result of a series of wars with Western powers looking to get trade access to China. China, not thrilled with this development. Okay, they were happy with their society, they liked being the regional power. They are not thrilled with these increasing trade developments. All right, we're going to skip way ahead here. 1930, I don't know. 1930, the Chinese Civil War begins. Does anyone know who the Chinese Civil War is between? All right, what do you got?
It's between the Nationalist Party, the Communist, and then the Communist Party of China.
Yeah, so the Nationalist Party, the KMT, and the Communist Party, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, have a civil war. The KMT is previously in power. There is a civil war where the CCP tries to take over in China, and they're having their internal war. But then something else happens. What do you think is going on in this period? Yeah, way in the back.
World War II.
Yeah, what happened to China in World War II? Anyone? Yeah.
Did they get invaded by Japan?
They did get invaded by Japan. Okay, so China gets invaded by Japan, and it's sort of, the Civil War gets put on hold, essentially, while they deal with the fact that they were invaded by Japan. It's not like they're not still jockeying for power, but they really need to deal with this, Japan invasion first. In that war, the Pacific Front of World War II, somewhere between 10 and 25 million Chinese civilians are killed, okay? And that is a huge number, 10 to 25 million. It's also a huge range, right? Like the error bars on that are huge. And part of that is just because the record keeping was very poor, and it's hard to determine what was attributable to war deaths versus, famine and other sorts of things. The Japanese were quite aggressive in China, in particular. One of my favorite sad facts about this is that they dropped fleas infected with the bubonic plague all over China to try and get the bubonic plague to weaken the Chinese forces. It wasn't super successful, but it sort of gives you an idea of the psychology behind the wars. They were really, Japan is trying to weaken the Chinese forces to take over China. 1945 happens. The power is returned to the KMT in China, and the Chinese Civil War sort of picks up where it left off, and continues for another 4 years until, in 1949, the Chinese Civil War ends with a communist takeover. Can anyone tell me what happened in the communist takeover in 1949? Mel.
Mao's Zedong and the Communist Party took over, and like the remaining nationalist people went to town.
Yeah, so Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT exiled themselves. They escaped to Taiwan. They maintain the Republic of China in Taiwan. Mao is established as leader of the CCP and the ruler of the People's Republic of China, which is the words in our topic, the PRC, the People's Republic of China. One thing to note is that CCP, Chinese Communist Party, is also sometimes referred to in the literature as CPC, like you can invert the letters, so if you see either one of those, it's the same thing. They're talking about the Chinese Communist Party. Okay, so now the communists are in charge in China, and from 1958 to 1961, they had what they referred to as the Great Leap Forward. And the goal for this was to turn China into a modern industrial power. This is probably one of the worst names in human history because it did not go well. Mao wanted the Chinese economy to stop being a subsistence farming economy. Subsistence farming means where you have a lot of farmers, but they're mostly farming for themselves and their families, and maybe they're towns, but you're not exporting large amounts of cereal or grain. And he wanted it to change into an industrial power like the United States or Western Europe. And so he forces the production of steel. He mandates that people leave their farms and go build steel and create factories. Unfortunately, when you have a bunch of people who are only making enough food for themselves, and then you mandate that they no longer make food for themselves, the result is a really tragic famine. And somewhere between 20 and 46 million people died during the Great Leap Forward. 20 to 46 million people, mostly from starvation. There was also this thing that happened where, because people were hungry, Mao decided that the sparrows in China, like the little birds, the actual birds, were eating too much of the grain. He was very upset that the sparrows were eating the grain and the people were starving. And so he ordered a massacre of the sparrows. Unfortunately, and those of you who've taken biology or environmental sciences can probably predict this, it collapsed the food system in large parts of China. So pests, which the sparrows had also been eating in addition to the grain, caused huge amounts of the grain to spoil, thus exacerbating the famine, which is really sad. Millions of people are also jailed or killed outright in protests during this period of time. Overall estimates put the number of deaths due to Mao at around 70 million, but that's a really contested figure. But most modern Chinese people recognize that Mao had a lot of problems. But he did move the Chinese economy from one that was not on the world scene at all to one that is on the world scene by the time of his death. The figure that keeps coming up over and over again is called the 70-30. And the idea is that Mao did 70% good and 30% overreach, which caused millions of deaths. You can make your own judgments on it. 1972 happens. Nixon goes to China. That is the first time in quite a while that the United States has had a relationship with China. That same year, the People's Republic of China, the communists in mainland China, are admitted to the UN and replace the Republic of China, which is now Taiwan. So, in that year, the PRC is admitted to the UN instead of the Republic of China. 1976, Mao dies. A man named Deng Xiaoping, D-E-N-G, X-I-A-O-P-I-N-G, comes to power. And while he is a continuation of the communist regime, he is also much more capitalist and interested in improving the economy than even Mao was. So the quote that's attributed to him that I think sums up this section, and you'll hear this a lot, is he said, "To get rich is glorious," which is obviously pretty different than a communist or socialist situation. But he believed that economic reforms were the way to improve China and the way to put it on the global scene. So he did a ton of economic reforms between 76 and 89. He disbanded the mandatory communal farming. And he switched from an entirely planned economy, meaning the government decides everything about the economy, to a mixed economy. This is often referred to as socialism with Chinese characteristics, or market socialism. And what that means is that there is a mix of capitalism and socialism going on in China. This is also the heyday of political reform. A lot of people in the 70s and 80s thought China was moving toward becoming like a Singapore-style democracy, where there's still a lot more government control than there is in the West, but much more political power for the people as well. 1979, I guess that's still in here. 1979, The United States recognizes the PRC as the official government of China. So prior to that, the United States had recognized the Republic of China, or Taiwan. And they de-recognized Taiwan as the official government of China. But that's also the year that we established the Taiwan Relations Act, which is the United States security guarantee to Taiwan. And you're going to debate about this a lot. We have a Taiwan affirmative that you might start reading sometime soon. But basically, the United States pledged that if China were to attack Taiwan to try and take it back over, the United States would defend Taiwan in that war. And there's a lot of debate about what that defense would look like and whether it's effective. But that sort of all happens the same time. U.S. security guarantee, but we recognize China. Okay. 1989 to 1992, there's a really big shift. Who can tell us what happened in 1989 in China? All right, what do you got?
Tiananmen Square protest?
Yes. So can you give me a little more? You got it. You got the content. Can you tell me anything about it? Fair enough. Protest. People are mad. Tell me something. Yeah.
College students in China started protesting, and in response, Jinping sent like the military to like suppress the protesters.
Yeah. So students and a bunch of workers. It's not just students, but there are a bunch of students involved. Students and a bunch of workers in China have a very large protest near Tiananmen. And Deng Xiaoping believes that that protest needs to be shut down in order to maintain Communist Party control, CCP control of China. And he orders a military response that includes tanks to put down this aggression, put down the protest. That also led to a series of crackdowns. So that sort of protest galvanized the conservatives in China who were concerned about the overall situation and wanted to make sure that the CCP remained in power. And so there's a period of time there where China is essentially a neo-totalitarian state. Neo meaning new, and totalitarian meaning entirely government-controlled system, with Soviet or Stalin-like leaders. So that is the sort of the period where China was the most aggressive. And it's still Deng Xiaoping in power, but the local level became a lot more aggressive at that time. 93 to 97, we got another little bit of a shift. It's a little bit of an opening up, a little bit of loosening up of restrictions, a shift to what they would call hard authoritarianism, which means the government is still an authoritarian government. They're still, it's not a democracy by any means. But people have a little more sway than they did before. And during that time, the president, who's now Jiang Zemin, did a lot of economic reforms, not a ton of political reforms, but we're moving toward economic reforms. 98 to 2008, this is the sort of heyday of economic and some political reform in China. It's when it became the most closer to a democracy, if we would draw a line like all the way from hard totalitarianism all the way to full democracy. It's moving toward a democracy. There was some multi-candidate voting, which means everyone in an election is a member of the CCP. It's not a true open election. But there's some voting that involved more than one candidate for the first time. The CCP increased transparency of what it was doing in the government, and they decreased media control and allowed more people to go abroad to get educated in other countries. However, in 2009, China sort of shifts back toward a more hard authoritarian system. Now, they shift toward the conservatives within the CCP and abandon many of the previous reforms that they had implemented. Why? There's a bunch of reasons that all came together sort of at the same time. These are relatively important to understanding where China is today. One of them is the Arab Spring. So pro-democracy movements elsewhere in the world really scared the CCP. Because when they see, some of the Middle East and North Africa having major revolts and overthrowing their governments, they became very concerned that that might occur in China as well, and so they increased the government control. There were also a bunch of riots in China, one in 2008 in Tibet that was very large, and one in 2009 in Xinjiang that was very large. And those both led to China thinking, uh-oh, the Arab Spring might be coming to us. Something else happened in China in 2008. Does anybody know? You might have watched it on TV. Yeah, the Beijing Olympics. So in 2008, the Olympics are in China. And the government used this as an opportunity to really crack down on security. And some of this is pragmatic, right? They really did not want something like a terrorist attack or some major uprising to occur while everyone is watching Beijing literally on TV for the Olympics. And they also wanted to increase government control, and this was a good way to do that. So a coalition of conservatives slowly came to power within the CCP during this period. Something else happened in 2008, mostly in the United States, but also in Europe. Yeah, what do you got?
The economic decline of the world.
Yes, exactly. The 2008 financial crisis also shook the sort of increased relationship that China had had with the Western world and their burgeoning economic relationship. And the reason for that is that so much of the United States' previous engagement with China was sort of saying, in the West, the rest of the West, Europe, etc., is saying, China, you should be more like us. You should make your economy more like ours. Our economy is so awesome. Your economy is not nearly as good as ours. Why don't you be more like us? Okay? And then 2008 happens, and the Chinese economy is doing okay, and the rest of the world's economy are very much not doing okay. And so China's response to that, which is super reasonable, is like, why should we be more like you, United States? Your economy is doing terrible, and we're still having major amounts of growth. Okay? So all of those taken together, that sort of package of things that happened in the period between 2009 and 2015, has led to more authoritarianism in China. Takeaways. With keeping it. So during this time, in the last few years, there has been decreased access to social media. There have been more censored and banned books. There's more persecution of the type of religious minorities and that sort of thing since 2012. China believes that refers to the century between 1850, right, where we started, and 1950 as the century of humiliation. Okay? There is sort of this palpable sense in Chinese society that there were 100 years where China was forced to submit over and over and over again to outside forces. You know, first Britain, then the rest of the West, then Japan. Okay, they are not happy with that period of time where China was forced to give in to the West on a ton of issues, and so they are looking to become a great power again. And sort of the 50 years between 1950, or I guess 65 years now, between 1950 and now, has been an attempt to redeem the society for the century of humiliation, which means they want to be a global power economically, they want to be a global power politically, and they want the rest of the world to recognize that China has come into its own. You will also notice that and when you go back through the timeline, there's sort of an oscillation, meaning back and forth, between periods of time where Chinese society is getting more open, right? More media, more political reforms, NGOs, people traveling abroad, and periods of time where China is getting more closed, meaning less of all of those things, more political repression. And we're generally in a period of relative closing compared to where we've been in like the 2009 up to 2008. Okay, so what is the Chinese government like? This is, and I'll like point to the important things, so if you can't read it, don't stress. This is what the 1982 Constitution of China says is the structure of the government. China is a one-party totalitarian state run by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP maintains its grip on power and has a strong relationship with the People's Liberation Army, which controls both external and some internal security. You don't need to worry about taking a picture of this. I'll post the whole thing online, by the way. So, very smart idea, but don't stress. I'll just post it. China spends more money on internal security, meaning security against its own people, preventing uprisings, than it does on national defense. So every time you see some chart that shows like China's military spending, okay, it's going to look like this. Okay, it goes up. You have to remember they are also spending more money on internal security than they even are on defense. China also cares a lot about its image in this period of time. The government is very interested in China being perceived internationally as a modern society and a global power. So this is the government structure. Officially, Congress is in charge. Officially, the president and vice president are slightly below and bow to Congress, or are in a relationship with Congress. officially, the military, the court, the logistical branch, and the state councils are under the Congress. Okay, so this chart is not that different than the United States, right? There's a division of power. This one says Congress has the most power. It's not like a divided three branches of government thing, but there are divisions of power. In reality, this is according to the Congressional Research Service. Their argument is that in reality, all of these things are subservient to the Communist Party. Okay, so Congress, they have Congress all the way down here. Okay, they do not believe Congress is in charge of anything. They say the CCP is control of all parts of the government. The paramount leader of China, which is an informal term meaning the most important person in China, is not only the president, but also the head of the CCP. So Xi Jinping, who we're going to talk about in a second, who internationally is referred to as the president of China, which he is also the head of the CCP. And what that means in practice is that, well, back on this chart, here's the two of them side by side. Back on that first chart, the president doesn't have a ton of powers. In practice, when the president is also the head of the Communist Party, it means they have a lot more powers than the Constitution would suggest. So, since 2012, the president has been Xi Jinping. That's him. He's an extremely powerful leader who is very much interested in ensuring that China does not have problems internally or externally. Some people say that he is the most aggressive leader since Deng Xiaoping. A lot of people, you'll see a lot of things referring to him as like the new Deng. His major issue is CCP corruption. He believes that the corruption within the CCP is the biggest threat, internal threat to China. And so he is simultaneously cracking down on corruption within the CCP and trying to strengthen the CCP overall. Because he thinks those are the same thing, right? Eliminate all the bad apples from the CCP, it will be very strong. He has increased crackdowns on civil society, especially foreign NGOs. So non-governmental organizations that do lots of aid and literacy and vaccines and all those things have mostly been kicked out of China. Not entirely, but mostly been kicked out of China. More than 500 activists or dissidents have been imprisoned. He has dramatically increased surveillance. So those of you who debated last year, lots of surveillance in China. It is going up, just like in the United States. And they have a new law that allows unlimited detention for any defaming information on the internet. So you can be detained for defaming, saying something bad about someone else, although really this mostly applies to saying something bad about the government in China. Within China, there are a bunch of regions that are not well integrated into China. Some of them actually dispute whether they are a part of China, while others more tacitly accept the government, but aren't thrilled about it. The first, so this is a map. All these yellow regions, plus Taiwan over here and Hong Kong down here, are areas in which the Chinese government has a different relationship. And we'll look at some of these, the most important ones for debate specifically. But China has, they have more internal ability to decide their own affairs than the other areas. Okay, so the first one is Xinjiang. Xinjiang is the largest administrative region of China. Okay, we're going back to the map. Way in the upper left corner, northwest of China. The picture is pretty representative. Lots of mountains, lots of people farming. There is a group of people there called the Uyghurs, U-I-G-H-U-R, or U-Y-G-H-U-R, or just for funsies, U-I-Y-G-H-U-R. The Uyghurs are a Muslim ethnic group that live in Xinjiang, and they don't consider themselves Chinese. And so the government has a lot of problems with Xinjiang because there are regular riots and protests there to suggest that they do not want to continue to necessarily be a part of China. The second area we're going to look at is Tibet. Tibet is an autonomous region of China, which means there's more local control than in the other provinces. It is also the least densely populated part of China. If we go back to the map, Tibet is just south of Xinjiang. So not a ton of people here. But it was not incorporated into the PRC until 1950, okay? So this is a very recent addition to China. And there's a whole group of Tibetan Buddhists who live there and follow the Dalai Lama. And in 1959, there's the Tibetan Rebellion, and the Dalai Lama flees to India in exile. And he's been living in exile ever since. Subsequent Dalai Lama also in exile. Most Tibetans also do not consider themselves to be Chinese. And China maintains a high military presence there to prevent another uprising. This is Hong Kong. It's a little different. Hong Kong is now an autonomous territory of China. Hong Kong was taken over by Great Britain in 1842. So during that series of beginning of the century humiliation, Britain gets Hong Kong. It was returned to China in 1997. And the phrase you'll hear here is one country, two systems. One country, two systems. And the idea here is that China is responsible, China meaning the People's Republic of China, the government in, the main government in mainland China, is responsible for defense and foreign affairs on behalf of Hong Kong. But Hong Kong has its own internal executive, legislative, and judiciary powers, and is essentially a democracy. It's like a moderate democracy. This is mostly working better than you would expect. But most Hong Kongers also don't consider themselves Chinese. And there was this huge series of protests in 2014 because China said they needed to pre-approve candidates for Hong Kong elections. Okay, so Hong Kong is a democracy. They have elections. There are parties. And then China said, that's great. You can have your elections, but we're going to need to sign off on all the candidates. And Hong Kong was like, whoa, 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 that is not what we agreed to. Two systems. We think this should be part of our system and not really part of your system. And so there's a lot of protests about how that's going to resolve itself in future years. Okay, Taiwan. We talked about it a little bit earlier. Chiang Kai-shek flees there with the Nationalist Party in 1949. The United States at the time backs Taiwan because we really don't like communists. We have shifted officially to the one China policy, which means that we consider Taiwan sort of a part of China. But we also continue to sell arms to Taiwan, and we continue to say we'll defend Taiwan if China attacks it. Taiwan is not really officially its own country right now. It is not internationally recognized, so it doesn't have its own seat at the UN. It doesn't have its own seat in most international organizations. It sort of has a quasi-independent status. There are really high levels of economic and tourism ties between Taiwan and China right now, which might moderate the chance of an actual conflict, like a war breaking out between the two. But the Taiwanese election that occurred early this year, the person who is now the president of Taiwan is much more aggressive toward China, much more pro-independence, or as China would refer to it, anti-reunification, right? They don't acknowledge the independence thing, they're like anti-reunification, than the previous set of presidents. And so it is a genuine open question right now what's going to happen between China and Taiwan, and you will see a lot of debate, arguments about it. So all of these regions have separate cultural identities, and all of them, to differing degrees, resist Beijing rule. Hong Kong and Taiwan are politically very different, and most people don't identify as Chinese. Xinjiang and Tibet are ethnically and religiously different, and also have some beefs with the government. So, the economy. We talked about the government, now we need to talk about the economy. Chinese economic growth was dramatic and unprecedented. This is a chart of the rate of growth. Okay, so for those of you who are like in calculus, this is like the derivative graph of Chinese economic growth. This is not how, like, the graph of economy growing, because it just goes up. This is the graph of the rate of Chinese economic growth. If that's a little beyond you at this moment, because you probably weren't chance doing math at debate camp, that's okay. But the thing to notice is that in 2007, Chinese economy is growing at 16% per year, which is just astronomical. Okay, astronomical, 16% per year. 2008, right? We all know what happened in 2008. Things are not going as well, but they're still going surprisingly well. Okay, so the United States economy is contracting during this period of time, and China's economy is still growing at like 8%. The rate of growth has slowed somewhat since then, and you will see a lot of things that suggest that the Chinese economy is slowing down. But what they mean by that is that the rate of growth is getting less, but not that the Chinese economy is not continuing to grow. Does that make sense to everyone? So the economy is still growing, very much still growing, just growing slower than it was before. Some people say that China has now caught up with the United States in terms of economic growth. That they believe that China is now nearly tied with the United States in terms of economic growth. Some people say it's going to happen around 2020. Some people say it'll be a little bit thereafter. But the meta thing to understand there is that this is the largest economy that the United States gets to deal with in the world, and that it is catching up to the United States with some debate about when it will actually catch up. So, the meta-Chinese economic strategy from 78 to 2013, so from the Deng period to 2013, their strategy was domestic infrastructure investment, so building railroads, building factories, building hard things that like live in China, and low-cost, low-end exports. So if you pick up like your water bottle, dollars to donuts, the bottom of it says made in China. Okay, and the reason for that is because it is a low-cost, relatively low-end export. So they're talking about dominating the clothing market, dominating the market for low-end consumer goods. They're trying to build all of the relatively cheap things in China and monopolize that, less like cars and that sort of thing. 2013 on, though, there's sort of a shift, and the economy is trying to transition into a situation where they would have more domestic consumer spending, which means more Chinese people buying Chinese goods in China, rather than exporting all of the water bottle, and more of an innovation or service-oriented economy. So more based on technology and more based on services like doctors and lawyers, and less based on producing items for export. There are some problems with this. One of them is called the middle income trap. And basically this is an economics and IR argument that says as countries industrialize, incomes increase, right? Which is great for the people who are getting that income, for sure. But it means they have less of a competitive advantage in low-wage manufacturing, okay? So when the United States sends jobs overseas that are like factory jobs, when a business is deciding where to send those jobs, one of the things they base it on is how much are they going to have to pay the workers. And as countries industrialize, workers demand more money for those jobs, and thus it becomes less competitive with other countries. So economies who are trying to industrialize or post-industrialize need to transition from just building things to more of a knowledge, innovation, service economy. And successful countries that have transitioned, you do not need to write down this list, just listen to it for a second, are countries like Japan, and South Korea, and Taiwan, and Hong Kong, and Puerto Rico, and Singapore, and Israel. Okay? Countries that have been largely unsuccessful so far at making this transition are most of Latin America, former Soviet republics, and most of Eastern Europe. And if you're thinking about that list, like the currently successful list and the not super currently successful list, the biggest difference is the status as a democracy, right? The democracies tend to work their way out of this problem. And a lot of the planned authoritarian governments have not yet. And so a really interesting question that a lot of people study is whether China can move to this new type of economy while still maintaining an authoritarian government. In China, all the big banks are state-owned, which means that they make all of the rules. There is a covert shadow banking system that's pretty unregulated, because if you can't get money from the state bank, you like go to some people who have their secret side bank. Those are pretty unregulated and thus lots of fraud. There's also a huge set of businesses in China called state-owned enterprises, SOEs. And you're going to be debating about this in the packet affirmative. There's a lot of discussion about SOEs and SOE reform. But basically, a lot of things that in the United States are owned by individual people or by shareholders, in China are owned by the government. And what that means is that those businesses have special government protection, right? Because if they're not making money, the government will just fix that. In the United States, one of our main beefs with China in trade right now is like, you are not allowing your businesses to trade on an equal playing field as ours. We do not prop up our businesses, you should not either. And it is, it is up for debate how much the United States does and should prop up its own businesses. And it is up for debate whether SOEs are good or bad for China, but that is a pressure point between the two countries. China also needs to increase its consumer spending, which means Chinese people buying things. In China right now, the household savings rate is 51%, which means that for every dollar someone in China earns, they save 51 cents of that dollar and only spend 49 cents of that dollar. It would be like if your parents gave you $100 to come to the SDI for like snacks and all sorts of fun things, and you were like, only going to spend $49 of that money. Gotta save the rest of it just in case, okay? In the United States, our household savings rate is about 5%, so theirs is about 10 times greater than ours. Now, there are a lot of people who think our household savings rate is way too low, right? So like you will hear lots of people saying, United States people, you need to save more money, like retirement PS. It is a problem to try and get China to produce things domestically that people will buy if people don't want to buy things. Does that make sense to everybody? And when you're anxious about your situation, you save more money. So if you think the government is not going to provide health care, the government's not going to help you in retirement, you're not sure how stable your job is, you save more money. And so one of the problems that China has to confront when they're trying to get their businesses, their domestic businesses, to be more profitable and more a bigger part of the economy is that people aren't buying things. They also need to increase innovation. Right now, most innovation happens in China in two ways. One is that they backwards copy Western products. And so there are some really weird situations where there's like an Apple store in China that's a fake Apple store, and all the people there thought they were working for Apple, and they're not working for Apple. It's like literally just a fake Apple store, but everything looks like Apple products because they backwards engineered a bunch of things. As we'll get to in a second, the United States not thrilled about that. Okay. The second problem, or the second way that they're increasing innovation, is government-funded research and development. So they will say, hey, scientists, we need you to fix this problem, go do it. And while that can be effective in the short term at solving relatively limited problems, in the long term, the best way in history that has led to innovation is just like a bunch of smart people exploring on their own, rather than the government telling them what to do. And so one of the open questions is like, is China going to change its education system to allow more people to do innovative research or not? The last structural problem for the Chinese economy is that people are getting really old. So you all have presumably heard of the one-child policy. And in truth, it was a lot more flexible in that there were definitely people who were allowed to have more than one child. But basically what happens is if you have a lot of people, and then you only allow 2 people to have one child, on average, okay, then as everyone gets older, there are more old people than young people. Yes, you can do the math on this. And it creates a problem where there are not enough workers to support the number of retirees that are coming in the future. And some people say this is the greatest problem facing China, because it's the one that they can't just necessarily like grow their way out of, because at some point people are going to be too old to work. Okay, what is life like in China? I think this helps us understand some of the reasons why US-China relations are so challenging, even in areas where we have common interests. So differences from the United States, there are obviously, a bunch of them. But the ones that I'm going to highlight, the first is that China has far lower racial diversity than the United States. 90% plus of people are Han Chinese. They have 55 recognized minority groups, which total 100 million people, which sounds like a lot until you remember that China has 1.3 billion people. And so it's not a lot. And generally the official government position with minorities is homogenization, not multiculturalism, okay? And we can certainly argue, and it is up for debate, what the United States' goal is with minority groups in our society and how well that's going. Not that great. But the goal in China tends to be more toward homogenization, making everyone part of the main Chinese culture, rather than different groups having their own culture. The second thing that's really different is the media is extremely tightly controlled in China. There's internet censorship, and a lot of the newspapers that you will even sometimes cut cards from are official CCP propaganda or official CCP documents, which means that it would be like if the New York Times, instead of being, its own independent business, were owned by the White House and just putting out pro-White House things. And we'll talk about how that puts things together with the United States in just a second. IPR, intellectual property rights, are also near non-existent, which means patents. Okay, patents are not well enforced in China, which means that there are tons of fakes. There's tons of media that's just like, you can buy the Harry Potter movies, but they're not made by the same people. They're just duplicated. There's tons of fake software, and tragically, there's a lot of fake medicine, which often doesn't go well. Chinese societal shifts. So I said, I framed it at the beginning, I think China's had the most dramatic social change in history. They went from an agrarian, pre-industrial, non-educated society to an urban, industrial, wealthy, educated society. And they did it in the shortest period of time that anyone has ever accomplished this. There's been a dramatic increase in quality of life in China, which has been great for the people who are getting that dramatic increase in quality of life. However, that increase has been uneven. There are still a ton of poor people in China. And it also increases their environmental problems, which you probably know a lot about. One statistic I like to just sort of imagine this is that China is going from 12 million cars in all of China in 2007 to 120 million cars by 2020. Okay? So it is a tenfold increase in the number of cars in only 13 years. You can imagine the effect that has on roads and pollution. There is a dramatic push for urbanization by the government. Their goal is to have 60% of people in urban centers by 2020. There's also the shift from young to old that we talked about because of the One China policy. One of the interesting things is that religion is starting to come back in China. So officially, China is an atheist state. Under Mao, all elements of religion were banned. Now there are a lot of religions that are still practiced, except for some persecuted minority groups like the Uyghurs, which we talked about in the Tibet. One interesting fact about this is that between 2030 and 2040, there will be more Christians in China than in the United States. Okay, so think about everyone you know in the United States, and think about all those people who are Christian. Not all of them are, obviously, but think about the ones you know that are Christian, and like sort of total those up in your mind. And then there's going to be more Christian people in China, which is officially still an atheist state, than there will be in the United States. Okay, so what are relations with the U.S. like? Meta relations. Post-2012, there's been some increased strain and decreased cooperation, but it's mostly stabilized. 2008, as I said earlier, caused China to sort of reevaluate the Western model and its role and relationship with the West. Because, if the United States isn't doing so well, why should they be trying so hard to become involved with the United States? Some IR scholars say that tension between the United States is inevitable due to rising power theory, which is that when a power rises, it inevitably comes into conflict with the established power. A lot of discussions of this go all the way back to the Peloponnesian War, if you are interested in historical things. But the U.S.-China relationship is really important. Will is going to talk a lot about U.S.-China relations in just a little bit. But preview, it's essential for the global economy. It is essential for energy policy. It is essential for warming. It is essential for trade. It has the highest propensity for a global nuclear war, world-ending war that exists right now. And so, while the process of the U.S.-China relationship is good, we have lots of contacts, we have lots of dialogues, we're always getting together. The substance is weak. There's a lot of stuff we still aggressively disagree on. And we often avoid key issues like Taiwan in order to work together on smaller issues. China is also relatively anti-interventionist, which means that they really strongly believe that there should be pro-sovereignty, that countries should not be messing with each other, invading, involving themselves in other countries' affairs. So it's often opposing United States power projection and United States interventions like Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay, China is not in favor of those things because it's very anti-intervention. So one of the most interesting things that I've learned recently is sort of what does the United States get wrong about China? And this part comes from Jeffrey Wasserstrom, who's a professor of history at UC Irvine. But when we were at Georgetown, I had a chance to confirm this with Wu Xingguo, who's a Chinese professor and renowned IR scholar. He's like the expert in China, in their university system, on relations with the United States and the security agreements with the United States. And their consensus is basically that the United States does not understand the ways in which China is diverse. So I said, not 10 minutes ago, that 90% of people in China are Han-Chinese. And because the main way we see diversity in the United States, or one of the major ways we see diversity in the United States, is racial diversity. Their argument is that people in the United States fail to understand Chinese diversity because we see people who are of the same race and think that there is not internal diversity. Do we have any Star Trek fans here? Few? Okay, I bet there are like 15 more who are like, I'm not raising my hand on the first day. Okay, so those of you who are Star Trek fans, the Borg is based on China. And it was a race of people in Star Trek that was a group of unthinking automatons with a single hive mind. And this professor's argument is that this is how too much of the United States views China, is just like an undifferentiated mass of people. And a whole set of people who are all doing the exact same thing. So this is a Chinese military drill. And so their argument is that because we don't see diversity of opinion in their media, which is the main way that we get news about China, because it's government controlled, and we don't see diversity within racial diversity other than some autonomous regions, we believe that all of China has one opinion. And you'll notice that I said, like, China thinks and China believes and all sorts of things in this lecture so far, and I'm sort of criticizing my own language choices there, because what I really mean by that is the official position of the government of China, or Chinese government officials have said. And there's a ton of diversity within China. If you think about 1.5 billion people, you are not going to get them to agree on anything, right? It's 1.5 billion people. It's 1 out of every 5 people on Earth. And so when we're thinking about China, we tend to think either people are just like 100% with the government or they're like dissidents fighting the government. When in reality, just like in the United States, most people are moderates. And so we need to understand that, you know, the official position of the government is not necessarily what, you know, the average person who you will meet thinks. And really, every time I say China, you know, believes or whatever, I should be saying the government of China has said, or many people in China believe. The other type of diversity that has been created is the generation gap. So we talked about how people are getting older, obviously no surprise there. But the generation gap creates diversity. Most middle-aged urban parents, so like the people who would be your parents' age, didn't drive in a car or make a private telephone call, like a person-to-person telephone call, until they were in their 30s. Well, their kids, your generation, have had cell phones, you know, about as long as you've had a cell phone. So that creates a really big difference. There's also a big difference between people who live in the cities and people who live in more rural areas that we'll get into another thing. So one thing I just want you to remember is that anytime you're reading evidence or thinking about, you know, how is China going to respond to X, most of the time what we're talking about is how is the CCP going to respond to X, not how are people in China going to respond to X. Okay, so what does China get wrong about the United States? This is also Jeffrey Wasserstrom, the professor at UC Irvine. And his argument is that people in China don't understand the media in the United States because it is so different from their media. So, in the United States, media is like information and commentary. It is not an official government position. And, interestingly, the United States media tends to be really negative. If you watch the 6 o'clock or 9 o'clock or 11 o'clock news, cheese and crackers is a depressant. It's like this horrible thing happened and this other horrible thing happened and then a bunch of people died. And I'm not even just talking about like this week when a ton of horrible things happened. The United States media tends to be very negative. It sees its role as being a critical force in shaping society, okay? And critique and criticism is important. In China, the media is a way of showing China positively to the rest of the world. So it is much more positive images like a PR campaign. What I want you all to do is to picture your high school's website, okay? And Chinese media is a lot more like your high school's website than it is like the New York Times, okay? So like the cover of Woodward Academy's website is not going to be like, Woodward Academy's SAT score's gone down. I wonder what's going on at Woodward. Maybe we need some changes, okay? It is not. It's going to be like, third grader does really well in the Nutcracker, celebrated, you know, chess champion in the 6th grade, etc. And the reason for that is because it sees itself as a PR campaign. China's media is a lot more like that than it is like our media. So what happens is that when the United States sees things like this, like memo to China, you are doomed to fail. This guy is just a commentator, okay? He is a commentator for the Wall Street Journal expressing his own personal op-ed opinions, his own personal opinion about something that is going on in China, okay? When China sees that, they're like, why is the US government always picking on us, okay? And if that is how your media works, it's not like this isn't like Chinese people are dumb, it's just like, it is a very different understanding of the relationship relationship of media, and so they don't understand why there are so much aggression from the US media towards China. The other problem is that because most of the media in China is all government controlled and sponsored, it means that people in China don't necessarily, or the average person in China doesn't necessarily appreciate the nuanced difference between like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and Fox News and CNN. Okay? So when you take all of that together, and lots of times the US media is doing something like a point counterpoint, you all know that, where it's like, here's an article that says China's going to succeed, here's an article that says China's going to fail. They're just like, why are you picking on us? Please stop. Okay, so they believe that when the United States media says bad things about China, it is either overt government messaging or like covert, subtle government messaging. So it's like Obama calling up, you know, Jason Zweig and being like, hey, tell China they're doomed to fail. And he's like, okay, China, you are doomed to fail. Okay? And it's not that simple. Obviously, nothing is. But it does create misunderstandings. So we don't appreciate their diversity. They don't appreciate, ironically, the diversity in our media sources. Okay, so major issues in US-China relations. I'm going to do this super quick because this is a huge portion of what Will is going to talk about in just a couple minutes. But major issues. We got trade, how free it should be, with whom it should be, and what restrictions we should have on trade. Will's going to talk about that a lot, so I am not going to talk about it very much. Another major issue is intellectual property rights. Okay, IPR. We talked about this earlier, about how China doesn't have a lot of patent protections. Well, the United States, who owns a lot of the patents that China is infringing on, is not happy about this. And so the United States wants China to crack down on these businesses who are infringing on US patents. China says it's pretty hypocritical of the United States to criticize them, because apparently the way we built our railroads in the 1800s was just stealing British technology, patented British technology left and right, and back engineering. Okay? So China's argument here is like, look in the mirror, United States. When you were industrializing, you did all of this stuff and more. So, you know, just because we're doing it now doesn't mean that we should be punished. Another one is human rights. So this one's interesting because U.S. sees China as a human rights violator, and you have probably heard a lot about that. Fun fact, China also considers the United States a human rights violator, a pretty aggressive one. So the basic difference here is that the United States sees human rights as protection from the government, okay? Protection from the government, negative and political rights. So when we're talking about human rights, we're talking about things like free speech, freedom of religion, democracy, ability to protest, ability to participate and make demands on your government, okay? China sees human rights as positive social and economic rights. So the duty of the government to take care of people, making sure people have food and health care and shelter and education. So China is pretty curious about why the United States is the richest country in the world, and yet we have, you know, millions of people who are homeless. China has a higher literacy rate than the United States does, and you know, there's a pretty reasonable question that's like, why is that? They also think that we're really hypocritical, okay? Because the United States, even though now we claim to protect a lot of these rights, anyone who knows literally anything about United States history knows that the United States was formed on the backs of slaves and Native Americans who were not given any rights at all. Okay, so China's argument is like, United States, again, mirror please, why are you criticizing us for just controlling our people when that's exactly what you did? And by the way, you know, slavery is a lot worse than preventing riots in Xinjiang, according to them. They also see a lot of our wars, like Iraq and Afghanistan, as explicit human rights violations, right? That, you know, going and bombing Iraq does not exactly protect their right to be free from government intervention. Another major issue is Taiwan, and we talked about this when we talked about Taiwan, so I'll just very briefly say that the United States still maintains a security guarantee, and we still give arms to Taiwan to protect it from China. For China, this is sort of like if the United States, if in the United States, China decided to arm Texas against the rest of us. And we're just like, hey Texas, here you go. Don't let the United States bully you. Okay, and just like, we just want to make sure that the United States isn't going to be too interventionist in your affairs. And obviously the United States would be like, excuse me? And so they, you know, there's a unbridgeable gap here that requires something else to happen differently. We also have conflicts, China also has some conflicts with our allies like Japan and South Korea. we have security guarantees that says the United States will intervene if they're attacked, which means that all of our relationships between those countries and China are also relationships between China and the United States. So let's look at that. So the main thing to notice about China is that it is a very crowded neighborhood. This is just like the Google map, and it's not super easy to see. But China has more direct borders than any other country on earth, okay? And most of the countries that it has border relationships with are also strong countries that have a lot of thoughts about how things are going in East Asia. And so those thoughts often lead to potential conflict. And some of the disadvantages we're going to be looking at are disadvantages based on China's relationship with the rest of the world. There's also, and I bet a lot of you have heard of these, a bunch of disputed territories. So this is a map of the China Sea disputes. If you look at the map, the purple line that goes all the way around the outside, that's what China thinks should be Chinese, okay? And then if you look at all the other lines, that's what everyone else thinks should be theirs, okay? So there's a bunch of islands that are disputed, and some of them are disputed because people want oil and natural gas rights to them, and some of them are disputed because they just want the ability to control the sea lanes and project their power. But all of these are areas in which there is a dispute about who is in charge of those areas. In particular, the South China Sea has a set of islands, the Spratlys and the Scarborough Shoal and the Paracel Islands, that are disputed. And the main dispute that's going on right now is between China and the Philippines and somewhat Vietnam about the Spratly Islands, these ones down here. And you notice that red line is what China thinks it gets. And all of those other lines are what the law of the sea would say that those countries get. And so there is an ongoing international law dispute about who's going to be in charge. And we're going to get those results next week, which is pretty interesting and might change some things on the top. There are also some disputed islands in the East China Sea between China and Japan. And Japan calls them the Senkaku Islands, and China calls them the Diaoyu Islands. And so they not only disagree about who's in charge of them, but they also disagree about the name, okay, which tells you how far this dispute goes. They can't even call it the same thing. These islands have been controlled by Japan since 1985, and China wants them back. And this is the most likely source of upcoming China-Japan conflict, is sort of this set of islands. Okay, so what does the future look like? Obviously, we don't know. But in the early 2000s, the debate was sort of like, is China going to collapse or is China become a democracy? And right now, neither one of those seems super, super likely. It seems a lot more likely that China is a little bit more stable but more aggressive, and that the CCP will be able to maintain power if it is able to deal with the protests and the uprisings that we talked about further. So if Mao was alive and he saw China today, he would definitely not think that this was his country, okay? It is extremely capitalist in a number of ways that he would strongly reject. But over the time, over that period of years, China has been able to, the CCP has been able to adapt to stay in power. And so the question is, how are they going to adapt in the future? This professor named David Shambaugh, who's a political science professor at George Washington and a senior fellow at Brookings Institution, says there's basically 4 things that could happen. Right now, China is the second one, a hard authoritarian state, and that could just continue. And he said if that happens, it's like a long, slow decline, okay? That the rate of growth will just continue to go down a little bit every year, and that eventually the CCP will have a lot of problems. He said that China could also go back into a neo-totalitarian state like they were right after Tiananmen, and that would probably be the worst outcome. He thinks it would lead to a breakup of China, an atrophy of their existence, and basically collapse. Okay, so moving to a hardline future. He doesn't think that's super likely though, because the private sector is so entrenched. But he thinks that if that were to happen, like the party and the military would split and there would probably be a coup, which doesn't sound very good for 1.3 billion people. He also says that one option is soft authoritarian. This is what the United States, or what China was between 2008 and, or 1998 and 2008. A more open society. The CCP is still the only party, but it's more open than it used to be. The question there is, can they grow their economy out of the economic problems, the structural problems we talked about earlier? And then finally, one option is like a semi-democracy. I don't think anyone really predicts like Western-style democracy, but it could be more like a Singapore-style democracy, where there are parties and elections but not full political freedom. And he thinks this is the best option for long-term economic growth, but he doesn't think it's going to happen. He thinks the most likely scenario is they sort of stay hard authoritarian as long as possible with sort of a long-term decline. Okay, so that is where I'm going to leave off today, pending any really urgent questions. My email address is debate@woodward.edu, like the word debate, at woodward.edu. So if you have any ongoing questions, or as you're doing your reading or looking at your notes later, you're like, I got some thoughts, I'm concerned, I have some things I want to ponder, feel free to shoot me an email, and I will answer that as fast as possible with my lab leading schedule. Will, you want to do 5 minutes? Yeah. All right, so let's take a 5-minute break, and then we will pick up with Will talking about the packaging. Thanks, y'all.